Welcome. We're going to go ahead and begin. I'm just going to make a couple of procedural notes, and I will soon introduce our host. On the table, I'm sure you've already noticed the index cards, which are for you to jot down any questions that may arise during the presentation. So please hold your questions until the until the Q&A, which will be after our table discussion. So grace to you and peace. I'm Dr. Kevin Clark. I'm Dean of the Institute for Lay Ministry here at Sacred Heart Major Seminary. Welcome to Sacred Heart. Welcome to our annual In the Heart of the Church Lay Ecclesial Ministry Speaker Series. Thank you, all of you, for coming, those here present and those here virtually. The Sacred Heart Major Seminary's Speaker Series for Lay Ecclesial Ministers in the Heart of the Church provides ongoing formation for men and women serving full-time or part-time in the Archdiocese of Detroit and beyond. This year, we have the honor of bringing in a faculty host to moderate the afternoon Q&A and introduce our In the Heart of the Church speaker. So please let me introduce Father Peter Ryan, a priest of the Maryland province for the Society of Jesus. Father Ryan was ordained in 1987. Before coming to Sacred Heart, he served as executive director of the Secretariat of Doctrine and Canonical Affairs at the USCCB. Prior to that, he served as professor of moral theology and director of spiritual formation at Kenrick Glennon Seminary in St. Louis. Professor of moral theology at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland, where he got to know our speaker today, and assistant professor of theology at Loyola College in Maryland. Father Ryan is a member of the executive boards of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars and the Courage Apostolate, was a senior fellow of the Westchester Institute for Ethics and the Human Person, and is a past president of the Jesuit Philosophical Society. He is currently working on a book tentatively called The Blessed, the Damned, and Personal Vocation, a Christological Eschatology. The fourth of 8 children, Father Ryan was raised in Kensington, Maryland. His brother William is a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington. Please welcome Father Peter Ryan.
Well, it's certainly a pleasure to be here, and it's also a pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker, Teresa Farnan. Teresa is a PhD. She's a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, focusing on the challenges of gender ideology as part of the center's Person and Identity Project. I found the resources there very, very helpful, and I recommend them to you, the Person and Identity Project. She's the co-author of 2 books, Get Out Now, Why You Should Pull Your Child from Public School Before It's Too Late. She makes a pretty convincing case. Even if this title sounds strong, you'll understand why she says it. Where Did I Come From? Where Am I Going? And How Do I Get There? Another book that she has co-authored. She's taught at St. Paul Seminary in Pittsburgh, Franciscan University of Steubenville, and Mount St. Mary's Seminary. By the way, when we were at Mount St. Mary's together, Teresa would sometimes have her youngest child in her arm, in one arm, when she's writing on the board on the other arm for the seminarians. Anyway, she's worked in the diaconate formation program for the dioceses of Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, has served also as a consultant to the USCCB's Committee on Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth, and is a member of the Catholic Women's Forum Advisory Council. She serves on the Ethics and Public Policy Committee of the National Catholic Partnership on Disability. She's lectured widely on gender ideology, Catholic education, theology of the body, the personalism of John Paul II, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and the vocation and dignity of women. She hosted St. Thomas Aquinas in Today's World on the EWTN. She received her master's degree and doctorate in medieval studies from the University of Notre Dame. And she and her husband, Michael, have no fewer than 10 children. It's my great, I think that's the real feather in her cap. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and good friend, Teresa Farnan.
I'm delighted to be here. I have to confess, I'm a little envious about your title for your forthcoming book. Sometimes you hear someone else's title and you think, I wish I were writing that book, but I can't wait to read it. Well, I really am very, very grateful to be here, grateful to be discussing this topic, grateful to Sacred Heart for hosting this, and to to the Archdiocese of Detroit for their willingness to speak out on this issue. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the issue of gender ideology and how it affects our youth in particular, although I will sort of bracket off the fact that we need to keep all these facts in mind, because when we get to the end, if we get a chance to discuss where I think this is going in our culture, given the fact that there's been growing awareness of how bad this is for children, we can't forget our vulnerable young adults either, right? And so I worry that we're going to settle on some kind of compromise that allows 18-year-olds who are struggling with mental health problems to continue to harm their bodies. But with no further ado, my course for today is this. I want to break down for you what exactly is going on here, because there is something at play here that illustrates a shift in our culture and its understanding of the person. And unless we address the anthropological problem, we are not going to be able to address this issue. So I'm going to start with anthropology, or philosophy of the person. Then we're going to actually look at what happens in a gender transition, and then we can work our way back to pastoral care, because you really have to have all the facts at hand. Now, currently, we're in a situation where, in a sense, there's an awful lot of rhetoric that's being used that obscures what's actually going on. And the rhetoric goes something like this. There is a special kind of child that is actually born in the wrong body. Okay? This is a child who interiorly knows him or herself to be the opposite sex. And unfortunately, the only way that child can be happy is to bring their body into alignment with their internal perception of themselves, their gender identity, okay? Once we do that, once that child does that, and provided we all go ahead and affirm that child in their perception of themselves, then they can lead a happy, authentic, fulfilling life. That is the narrative that we're hearing increasingly, that we've been hearing really since 2016 about children who are undergoing medicalization of their bodies. Okay? Now, with Person and Identity Project, we work a lot with parents. And so we hear a different side of the story. And it goes something like this. And I'm sorry, the print here is sort of small because I wanted to get the whole quote in. This is something a mother wrote on, there's a Substack for parents, and she wrote, "On February 24th, 2024, my life changed forever. My world crumbled and my heart shattered into a million pieces. We were totally blindsided by what was being said, and at first I didn't know how to reply. How could a young man who had never shown any feminine tendencies his entire life now tell me he always wanted to be a girl and was transitioning into one, and then proceed to tell me that he is not gay? So of course my question was, then why are you doing it? I don't think I got a response that made any sense. The first conversation turned into a lot of hurt, angry words on my part, tears streaming down my face as I was told I had to accept this new person my son was becoming and forget the baby boy I held in my arms." Okay? So there's a side of this story that only now is beginning to be surfaced in our public conversations. And so our job today is to look at this situation and try to break through some of the rhetoric and see what is actually going on. Now, always as Catholics, we go back and we situate ourselves in the heart of the church as we're discussing any kind of topic, and especially one that deals with moral theology or with care for the most vulnerable. So, of course, we can look to the example of Pope Francis and, from him, take our lead in terms of how we are to treat people who are suffering. And he has such a pastoral heart. So he's constantly reminding us, when you see people who are on the peripheries, who are marginalized, or who are suffering, we have to accompany them and never abandon them. And in particular, Pope Francis has been remarkable in terms of his outreach to one group of individuals who identify as transgender, who live in a neighboring town in Italy, who came to his attention during the COVID pandemic because they were homeless, unemployed, and starving on the streets, right? And so this is the group that he's become very close to, right? So he is really, they're the group that he invited to the Vatican to prioritize them for vaccination during the pandemic. But on the other hand, Pope Francis, since 2014, has been sounding a drumbeat of alarm. And what he is saying to us is that gender ideology is a dangerous ideological colonization. In some of his speeches, he's referred to it as wicked, as the enemy of marriage and the family. He calls out the fact that they are teaching this in schools. So we, as we start this discussion, I'm putting both of these slides out here. Pope Francis with his pastoral heart, and Pope Francis calling out the ideology that's harming people, so that we are reminded to have this kind of nuanced approach. Our culture does not do nuance anymore. But as Catholics, we're called to have that nuance, where we love and care for the people who are suffering, while at the same time staying firmly rooted in the truth about the person. Okay? And make no mistake, this is a cultural phenomenon that has to do with how we understand the person. Now, in our culture, you will see that the youth you deal with are very, very concerned with questions of identity. But that's okay. That's all right. In Fides et Ratio, in the first chapter, Pope John Paul II sets out the questions that he regards as questions that are foundational, that every person has to answer in his or her life. And they are questions of identity. Who am I? These are the questions that, when he says that everybody is called to be a philosopher, you begin to sort of search for wisdom by asking and answering these questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of life? What does God have in store for me? And the answers that you give to these questions are the answers that aid you in your search to discern your personal vocation, that carry you through the rest of your life. We regard the ability to ask and answer these questions as really an essential part of the process of maturing, of becoming an adult, okay? But these questions are not asked and answered in a vacuum. And I propose to you today, okay, with the church, using sort of thinking with the mind of the church, that when you ask and answer these questions, you do so with a framework in mind. And the framework that you bring to bear on how you answer these questions is your understanding of what it is to be a person. The word that the church uses for that is anthropology. Okay, the study of the human person. And whatever you understand to be true about the person acts as a kind of lens to help you frame your understanding of who you are and how you relate to everyone else. And I love using some of these vision finder analogies because they illustrate how, anthropology functions a bit like a lens. It can either clarify the picture for you, right? I wear glasses. If I don't have my glasses, everything is blurry. I can't see everything the way I should. On the other hand, if I were to pick up my husband's prescription, his glasses, I would not be able to see correctly. I might be missing parts of the picture. So our understanding of who we are as a person functions like that. And the church reminds us of that. And the church even says the way you can judge a culture is by whether or not it has this kind of correct anthropology. In the Compendium for Social Doctrine, there's a whole section on this in paragraph 558. And it's a great discussion, reminding us that we need to make sure that we avoid any kind of anthropology that is reductionist or rooted in ideology. Okay? So, traditionally, the person has been understood in this way. This is the anthropology that comes down to us. We would describe it as Christian anthropology because, yes, I'm bringing what we know to be true from Revelation into the conversation, right? But this is also an anthropology that is solidly rooted in Aristotelian philosophy, right? And it brings in some of the elements of the other classical philosophers, firmly rooted in reason, known intuitively, and borne out by experience. So this is not something, we're not like some of the Protestant denominations that don't bring philosophy into the conversation and sort of limit themselves to talking about what sacred scripture tells us. No, this is something when just as an anecdote, I remember reading Abigail Schreier's book and Irreversible Damage. And she has a chapter in there where she interviews a woman who is a lesbian in a civil union who's bringing up 2 kids and one of her children identified as transgender. And in this interview, this woman, this mother, this concerned mother, relates her alarm at looking at some of the materials her daughter was bringing home from school that had to do with gender ideology. And she said, it was just so bizarre. It almost made it seem like the person wasn't unified. And I thought, bingo! This is such a great example of how this Christian anthropology is rooted in reason. Here's this woman who doesn't share our faith, and yet she too understands that there is an essential unity about the person. So what does Christian anthropology tell us about the person? That your primary identity is that you are a son or daughter of God. Primary identity. You are created as a person who is embodied, either male or female, with an integral unity of body and soul. Full stop. Okay? Now, created by God, son or daughter of God, yes, that's from Revelation, but the unity of the person is a truth that we can hold from philosophy. And human embodiment, up until the last 8 years, has never been questioned. Embodiment as male or female has never been questioned. Never been questioned. So we can hold these truths by reason. What else does Christian anthropology tell us? Well, I want to highlight in particular this point about the body, that the body has intrinsic meaning. It's not just this random meat suit that you inhabit. It is you as a person, you are this unity of body and soul. Your body is you. You can't separate yourself or disassociate yourself from the body, okay? We see this in the language of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, where the Catechism uses the term sexual identity to discuss this phenomenon. What does it mean by sexual identity? It means that your identity is inseparable from your embodiment as male or female. And that it has to do not only with just this body, but then it comes into it becomes a factor in terms of your moral life, your spiritual life, your emotional life, your vocation. It is so crucial to who you are. It is not just this random fact. Okay? Moving along, if we dive a little bit deeper into this, and consider what it means to be a human person embodied as either male or female, we can look at it this way, right? Traditionally, the soul has been understood as the first principle of life, right? And so from the moment of conception, your male or female body, genetically, biologically, male or female, is joined with your human soul. And the experiences that you have as a person, as this unity of body and soul, are going to be experiences either as a male person or as a female person. Okay? What does that mean for us? That means there is no possibility of misalignment. There is no possibility of a male soul being parked in a female body or vice versa. And to suspend, to sort of suspend our Christian way of understanding and try to put ourselves in the shoes of people who think there is a possibility. How does that work? How does that work? How do you square that with creation, right? Is it the case that when God is creating people, he gets a little distracted and puts the wrong soul in the wrong body? Like, exactly how does that work? It makes no sense whatsoever. Okay? Being created male or female is so important and speaks to the fact that we are relational beings. Why? Because the power to reproduce is the only power that you as a human person cannot exercise by yourself. You need a person of the opposite sex in order to be able to reproduce. Okay? Now, this is all borne out by science, right? Science tells us that every cell in your body is sexed, S-E-X-E-D. Every cell in your body has sex, reflects your sex, right? Every single cell. And we know that because the NIH has specified that when you do research studies, you need to specify whether or not your subject is male or female. Now, why would they do that? Well, in the 1990s, there was a growing realization that science, that medical research was being done mostly on male subjects. And so as a result, they were missing important things about women. And one example in particular would be the fact that for so many years, the medical community missed the signs of something like a heart attack in women. Why? Because whenever they studied heart attacks, they studied them in men, right? And so the classic symptoms, we were told, were like pain in your left arm. And then there was suddenly a growing realization that when women experience heart attacks, they don't experience pain in their left arm. They experience indigestion. Now, why does that happen? It happens because you are physiologically different, and that physiological difference is in every cell of your body. So that something like a heart, you would think a human heart could be kind of interchangeable, but no, men and women experience signs of heart attack differently, right? We also know, if we just sort of take a step back and think about what it means to be a sexed person, that sex is, despite what our culture is saying, sex is binary. How do we know that? There are only two types of gametes. There are male gametes and female gametes. There is no third gamete, right? So you are either the kind of person who could produce male gametes or the kind of person who could produce female gametes, okay? So sex is binary because reproduction is binary. And sex is for the sake of reproduction, okay? All right. Now, this isn't rocket science. Even someone like Richard Dawkins, again, I'm trying to sort of drive home the fact that this is not something that we know that we hold based on faith. Someone like Richard Dawkins, who is a rabid atheist, has come out publicly and said, this makes no sense. Of course, there are only two sexes, right? Now, part of the confusion in our culture that's sort of being given to our, placed on the table to just confuse our children, is that there is a tendency today in our culture to mistake personality traits or interests for identity, right? And so our young people are being told that if you have certain interests, if you have certain preferences, if you dress, if you act a certain way, that might mean that your identity is something that's at odds with your body, right? And this chart I find to be incredibly helpful because this was an endocrinologist, a psychologist, and then someone who researched sex trait differences who mapped out some of these personality traits. And what they found was that there are women who have personality traits or interests that overlap with men. And there are men who have personality traits or interests that overlap with women, right? Does that mean they're the opposite sex? No, not at all. All that means is that is someone who has unique interests, okay? Giving you an example. When I was in 6th grade, I did not own a dress. I lived in pants. My hair was very short. I was very close with my brothers. I would play with my brothers constantly. I was very interested in sports and reading books. I was that purple dot right there, that dot in the purple section over there in the blue area. And then as I got older, I was drawn to a field like philosophy, which was a male-dominated field. And to this day, I'm still very comfortable being around men. Does that mean that I'm not a woman? No, it just means I have unique interests. I have a daughter who is a female engineer. Does that mean she's not a woman? No, it means she's gifted in math and science, right? I have other daughters who are way over there in the pink. They're just different. Everyone is unique. Everyone's interests are different. All right, so this is the picture, just to sort of buzz through it really quickly and get back to this. This is what we hold to be true from Christian anthropology. And this has been understood for centuries to be the truth about the human person, right? If you were to talk to your grandmother, this is the framework that your grandmother would be using to understand the human person. If I were to talk to my parents, this is the framework. They would be utterly baffled by the framework that we're operating from today, okay? So known, revealed by sacred scripture, yes. Knowable by reason, and supported by science, and able to take into account the differences between human beings, right? We are not stereotyping or boxing kids in by holding to an account of the person based on Christian anthropology. In fact, our account gives them the flexibility to develop their unique interests and personality. All right. Well, that didn't last, unfortunately. And I mean, we could probably go through a whole philosophy lecture and trace back the origins of postmodern culture. But in the interest of time, I will sum this all up and say, from the Second World War on, we have really been trending towards this postmodern culture where everything has been on the table. And I think you can trace it back a little bit to some of the disillusionment that occurred after the Second World War. That's what Pope John Paul II attributes it to, where people in the face of such great evil began questioning whether truth was even possible or whether any understanding of the person was even possible. Once you reject the framework of faith, though, because we have moved into a culture that is no longer Christian. So in addition to being postmodern, we are in a post-Christian culture, okay? And it's characterized by the rejection of any kind of overarching truth. The defining characteristic of postmodernism is this belief that there are no more meta-narratives. What do they mean by meta-narratives? That means it's an overarching explanation that gives framework and meaning for how you understand things. Well, postmodernism sort of does away with all of that and posits instead that all truth is local and localized to you. So you have your own story, your culture has its own meaning, you can write your own story, and most important, you cannot judge anybody else's because there's no truth or no meaning outside of each individual person. Okay, so I would say especially from 1968, most of the time when you look at political or intellectual historians, they will place 1968 as this really important year. It kicked off the sexual revolution, but it also marked the year when some of these postmodern ideas began to seep into public consciousness. Now, one of the reasons why postmodernism is so corrosive of our understanding of who you are as a person person is you're no longer able to filter out any of these other harmful ideologies that are circulating at the same time. So in addition to being told that there's no truth, we're living in a culture right now that includes elements of all of these other toxic ideologies, right? And so you think about these young kids that you're working with, or young families, or young adults. When you talk to them, what you'll find is they've been exposed to like this dizzying array of undercurrents of ideas because they're on social media. So they're bombarded by all these conflicting messages. But the one message that is sort of drummed into their head is that you can't judge, right? And so it becomes a little paralyzing. They're bombarded with materialist messages. They're bombarded with Marxism. If they're in college campuses, they're being exposed to a steady diet of, and by Marxism, I don't mean the economic theory. I mean the theory that posits that the driving force behind human history is power struggles and power dynamics. So they're exposed to all of that. They're exposed to like this constant insistence that empowerment only occurs when you have absolute autonomy, and that the measure of success as a human person is this autonomy. They're exposed, they're constantly told that the only authority in their life is science. They're told that their own personal authority, right? So science is sort of our cultural authority. Their personal authority, though, is their own feelings, right? And so you can see none of this hangs together. None of this makes sense. If you start trying to map out all these currents and try to come up with a coherent philosophy, you're not going to be able to do it. But that's the problem with a postmodern society, which is that these kids are exposed to, our young people have been exposed to these kinds of intellectual currents with no guardrail and nothing, no measure, no ruler, nothing to help them figure out or discern whether or not any of this is true, right? And so they're operating in this culture that in some ways is just confusing and dizzying, okay? So if this is sort of our culture, remember, when we looked at the Compendium of Social Doctrine, every culture has an anthropology. And gender ideology is the anthropology of our postmodern culture. Now, it didn't come from a vacuum. There is a history for the whole idea of gender identity. Gender identity doesn't appear in any research studies until sometime. There's one reference, I think, in the 1950s, and then there are a few more in the 1960s, but it's always used interchangeably from sexual identity, right? Someone just sort of casually uses the word gender identity. And it isn't until this researcher, John Money, that the idea of gender as a social construct begins to work its way into our society. And it's picked up and adopted by feminist culture, but it doesn't primarily come from feminism. They're adopting it. It comes from this postmodern view of the person, and in particular from this one individual. Now, the history, I think this is an important thing to understand. The history of gender identity is marked by fraud, deception, and abuse of very vulnerable people. The first time this was written up, where it was written up as a possibility that you could take a child, medicalize them, and change their sex, was an experiment done by this researcher, John Money at Johns Hopkins, where there were parents in Canada who were minimally educated, this very young high school educated couple who had two twin boys. Twin is important because then you have a control. And they went to do a late circumcision. So the twins were about 6 months old. And when they went to circumcise them, there was a terrible accident, and one of the twins had his genitalia burned off, like almost completely obliterated. So these parents were devastated. They didn't know what to do. And at some point, they saw a TV show with John Money on this daytime talk show talking about how he was able to operate on people to change their sex. And so for the first time, these young parents thought, maybe he can help us. And they brought their twin boys to him, and he said to them, Okay, no problem. Take your son home. We're going to do an operation to remove any trace of male genitalia. Take him home, raise him as a girl, never tell him about it, and he will be a girl, right? Easy peasy. Gender is a social construct, right? His gender identity is whatever you socially construct it as. And so they did, right? And he began writing research articles talking about the success of his experiment. He was writing phrases like, Brenda sits here daintily playing with her dolls in her neat little frock, right? Lace-trimmed socks, like perfect manners, et cetera, et cetera. And the reality couldn't be farther from that. Because in reality, this child was struggling in school. He was getting reports home from his teachers talking about how they couldn't understand why Brenda only wanted to play with the boys, got in fistfights, couldn't keep his clothes clean, and had terrible penmanship. Right? And he was like a total discipline problem. At the age of 14, the parents were so desperate, they took him to a psychologist in Canada who said, you need to tell him. And from that moment, he reclaimed his identity. But in the meantime, John Money continued to write this up as a resounding success. Now, the tragedy is both he and his brother ended up dying early. His brother died of a drug overdose. He committed suicide, and it came out later that the two boys had been, that when they would go down to see John Money, in order to try to confirm Brenda in his new gender identity, John Money was having them engage in sex play on each other, which was part of the issue. So this is the origin of this gender identity theory. And this is its modern day iteration, okay? These are the graphics that are handed to children in a gender clinic, given out in some of our schools, in our kindergartens even, in some schools, part of comprehensive sex education programs, and pushed into schools through clubs and gay-straight alliances and things like this. These are images. This image here, the genderbread person, is handed out by USAID in the developing world, which is what Pope Francis means by ideological colonization. Now, taking a deeper look at this, one of the first things you notice is that what it does is it breaks the person into 5 or 6 different dimensions, depending on what graphic you're looking at, okay? And the most important aspect of the person is gender identity, which is represented on the gender person with the little cabbage leaf to mean your brain, and on the gender unicorn with the little rainbow, right? So gender identity is, wait for it, right? We've all been led to believe gender identity is this concrete, sort of essentialized fact about a person. But when you actually look at the definitions of gender identity from groups like Human Rights Campaign, they define gender identity as a child's self-perception. So how do you think about yourself? That is your gender identity. But for this graphic, for this anthropology, that's everything. That's dispositive of who you are. The way you think about yourself determines who you are, and everything else flows from there, right? Your gender expression is how you dress, how you wear your hair, etc., what your interests are, etc., etc. They include in these graphics sex assigned at birth. Now, once you ask a child what your sex assigned at birth, what is your sex assigned at birth, you have planted in that child a seed of doubt as to whether or not that actually is what their sex is. Because that question there, sex assigned at birth, immediately disassociates you as a person from your sexed body. Your sexed body might be right, or it might be wrong. And who can tell? Only you can tell. How do you know? You think about your gender identity. How do you perceive yourself? That will tell you whether or not you're born in the wrong body. That is how the psychology of this new anthropology works. And then they throw in these other categories, sexual attraction and romantic attraction, which actually have nothing to do with whether or not they medicalize a child. They have nothing to do with it. They confuse the issue so that a young person who is experiencing same-sex attraction, or who's like sort of all over the place in terms of their hormones, suddenly starts thinking, well, oh my gosh, I have a crush on this other person. Maybe I'm gay. Wait, maybe I'm not gay. Maybe I'm trans, right? It confuses the issue by asking children about sexual attraction before they're old enough to even know what sex means, or to know what it is, or to know anything about the person, okay? When you look at this anthropology and you sort of consider exactly what the implications are, it comes down to this. Just as with Christian anthropology, we talk about your primary identity as being a son or a daughter of God, your primary identity, according to gender ideology, is a task given to you. You are the one who discerns who you are. Only you. Our kids are told that they are the only one who knows their gender identity, and that they understand or they figure it out by thinking, by going deep within themselves and determining how they feel about themselves. So in a sense, what we're asking our kids to do is to self-create. You can no longer use the body as a reference for the way God creates you. You're in charge of determining your own identity. We are immersing them in a dualist philosophy where you as a person are your thoughts about yourself, your mind, your desires, your will, and then your body becomes this extrinsic, almost like luggage, right? That you're sort of carrying around or inhabiting. And in many cases, for these kids, once they start thinking about their gender identity, gender clinics will tell them, our goal is to bring your body into alignment with who you know yourselves to be. Now, just think about how radical that is. What a radical shift that is in our understanding of medicine. Medicine traditionally has been to heal the body. Now we're being told that medicine is now a discipline that is at the service of your embodiment goals. And that is exactly the language some of these physicians will use. Okay? This has ripple effects for everything, for marriage, for sex, for family, for your understanding of the body, for your understanding of human nature. There is no self. It's now, in the Congregation for Catholic Education, they refer to this as as modern liquid culture. There's nothing there. It's the utopia of the neuter, right? Where you just empty the human person of anything that marks it with identity, and then you get to choose your own. And so what you can see is that what we have here are two irreconcilable views of the person. You cannot square these two visions of the person. You either believe that you are created by God with a human nature, embodied male or female, or you believe that you are your thoughts and your beliefs about yourself, and your task as a person is to figure that out and then bring your body into alignment with who you are, who you know yourselves to be, in pursuit of your own truth. Now, this is radical. This is so radical, and it's also counterintuitive, which is why this ideology constantly uses graphics. These graphics are catechetical in nature. They are teaching the person about they are teaching our children a new understanding of the person. They are available as coloring pages. Understand this. These are designed to sort of grab the attention of even the very youngest kids and then change their understanding. But as part of it, because this is so counterintuitive, they're working on everyone else in our culture in order to change our understanding of who the human person is. And one of the ways they do this is by policing language, right? And so every single one of these organizations, Human Rights Campaign, GLSEN, Gender Spectrum, the ACLU, Southern Poverty Law Center, the first thing they start off with is a glossary. They will not even tell you what gender identity is until they declared the terms. They give you the vocabulary, and then they invite you into the philosophy. So everything you begin, and look how much this language, think about how much this language has seeped into our culture. We don't even blink an eye when someone uses the dichotomy trans and cis. We're so used to that because it's being used constantly. We don't even blink an eye when someone uses the phrase sex assigned at birth. It's on all of the forms our kids are filling out. They are asked when they do something like when they open up their college board account, they're asked what their gender identity is and what their sex assigned at birth is. Routinely. Medical forms, physical. My kids are all in a Catholic school, but one year the nurse picked up, I don't know, she just was, she was overworked and wasn't really thinking, and she grabbed a form from used a form that was used by one of the school districts and sent it home, and it asked about gender identity. And I was like, that was an immediate phone call. Hello. And she immediately, she just didn't even look. She didn't even look. But imagine that. This is the form that goes home to every single family in one of our major school districts. It's everywhere. Everywhere, even in medical journals, using phrases like bodies with vaginas and pregnant men. Oh my goodness, okay? We're seeing this creeping into federal law where sex has been redefined as gender identity, right? And where gender identity and gender expression are prioritized over freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, parental rights, and healthcare conscience rights. In the administrative state, and Michigan is one of the states that's subject to this, my own state, Pennsylvania, also is, Title IX has been redefined so that it's no longer about sex, it's about gender identity, which makes it utterly meaningless. It means anyone can declare themselves to be this member of a protective class. And we're seeing that have implications in things like athletics. Now, it's important to understand sort of the origins of this from a medical standpoint, right? There have always been instances of people who experience distress about their sex and their identity. Always, right? But it was a vanishingly small group. In the past, it would have been 0.002% of the population. It was understood to be a disorder. Then it's been slowly redefined depending on the organization. In the United States, we've kept it as gender dysphoria, indicating that the problem is when you feel distressed about it. In Europe, because they have socialized medicine and they don't need to justify their insurance treatments or their insurance payments, they just merely define it as a difference, right? There are some people who identify with their bodies and there are some people who don't. What's the difference? Right? It's all the same. But in the past, it would have shown up it was vanishingly rare, and the typical cases would have been adult males, people like Bruce Jenner identifying as Caitlyn, and that's a different subset. And we can talk about that in the Q&A, but that's not going to be the focus today. Or it would have been young children, and the typical case would have gone like this. I found this in a journal article. There was a mom and dad, and a family composed of mother, father, a 3-year-old boy, and an infant girl. The baby girl dies of SIDS, and the family's ripped apart. Dad disassociates and buries himself in his work. Mom is inconsolable. And so the little boy, trying to fix it, announces that he's a girl. Because in his mind, his childish way of thinking, right, mom and dad are sad because his sister is gone, so he'll be the sister and fix the family. Right? Fortunately, it was in the 1990s, and they got grief counseling. And that was what that family needed, and the therapist reported that everybody was able to sort of pull it all together. Now what we're seeing is a dramatic and stunning difference where the population of people who are identifying as transgender has shifted so that it's mostly teenage girls. Increasingly, though, I will note, we're seeing more and more teenage boys, many of whom, and there are many factors. They could be, on the autism spectrum, teenage boys who have been involved in pornography, teenage boys who are expending excessive amounts of time online, or who have had other trauma, right? In the past, when someone identified as transgender, by the time puberty rolled around, 80% of those cases would resolve with what was referred to as watchful waiting. Now, watchful waiting did not mean not doing anything. What it meant was that you would work with the child on some of the comorbid issues. Comorbid issues might be anxiety, depression, sexual abuse, trauma, whatever it is, someone who's on the autism spectrum. Now, because we've changed our model of treating these kids, only 3% of these kids desist. So because in the United States and in Western Europe, we've adopted this model of gender-affirming care, we have altered the course of this disease, and at the same time, it's becoming more and more prevalent. Okay? So there's something going on here that is not naturally occurring because of the way we're addressing this issue. Okay? Now, if you look at the DSM, for children, what they will say is the way you would sort of diagnose it would be the following characteristics. You would have to desire to be the other sex. You would have to prefer cross-gender plays, clothing, toys, things like that. Now, what I want you to notice, the takeaway here is when you look at the DSM-5, all of this has to do with the child's feelings and preferences. Remember that chart I showed, the Quillette chart, showing that you can have these overlapping interests. Well, now when a child comes in and expresses those overlapping feelings, suddenly now that puts them at risk for this diagnosis of transgender identification. Now, this looks like it's very scientific, right? Like, okay, they're going to spend a rigorous like analysis or investigation trying to decide whether or not this child actually is transgender. But that's actually not what goes on. That is not what goes on. How do we know that? Well, we have the head of Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago caught on Zoom during one of his seminars for parents saying, parents will ask me, are you sure? And his response is to turn to the child and say, what gender identity do you have? And he said in this presentation, there are no tests we need to do. There's no imaging, there's no scale, there's no forms. It's the child's say-so. And in fact, right now there's a lawsuit against Boston Children's because one of the psychologists involved in assessing this was trying to do research and long-term follow-up, started raising questions about the fact that Boston Children's Hospital, which is one of the top institutions pushing this, had changed its assessment model from multiple visits to a 2-hour visit before you begin to medicalize these children. And they fired her for questioning it. So that litigation is pending right now. Gender-affirming care looks, we could think about it as sort of a succession of dominoes, okay? Once that child identifies as transgender or has this, develops this, or believes that they have a gender identity at odds with his or her body, then it starts the dominoes tumbling. First, they begin the social transition, which social transition sounds so benign, but it is a psychological intervention that cements an identity. And those are not my words. That was the assessment of Hilary Cass, who conducted the Cass review in the UK. And in fact, she warned that physicians should be very careful not to socially transition children because it's like putting your thumb on the scale. It locks these children into an identity rather than, it's being sold to parents as an opportunity for exploration, but it cements this identity. Then it's followed by puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and tragically in many cases. The reason why we use this domino model is as soon as you take that first step of social transition, 95 to 97% of those kids still identify as transgender 5 years later. As soon as you go on puberty blockers, anywhere from 90 to 100% of those kids will go on to cross-sex hormones. It begins this, it's like a funnel that you can't get out of. You start down that funnel and how do you get out? Because suddenly you're socially locked into this identity. And at every step, when you express your misery or your unhappiness or your anxiety, people around you, the adults around you are telling you, oh, you're still struggling. Try this step. This will make you feel better. And that's why it functions like this set of dominoes. So social transition involves changing your name, using the preferred pronouns, changing your hairstyle, your clothing, your social participation, okay? Most of the time for social transition, we see this a lot in the younger grades in school, right? And up until that will sort of persist as the sole intervention until Tanner stage 2. Now, the claim is these children know who they are. But the reality is, as soon as you socially transition a child, you begin to widen that gulf between that child and other children of the same sex. Because now, instead of figuring out the social dynamics of being a boy or being a girl, now they're hanging around with the opposite sex, and they never have that chance through that kind of friction to be able to figure this out. The next one, at Tanner stage 2, these children are put on puberty blockers, which are powerful drugs like Lupron or some of the other medications that are used in precocious puberty in order to stop a child from going into puberty too soon. Now, these are being used on children with healthy bodies, and it's an experimental off-label use. The claim is that they are safe and reversible. The claim is it gives kids time to think. The claim is that it will improve their mental health. The reality is that all of those claims are false. It does not give kids time to think. How do we know that? Because almost all of them proceed on. Almost all of them, 90 to 100%. It is not safe and reversible. We know there are measurable impacts in terms of bone formation for these children because they never develop the bone density that puberty would give them. And even if they go on cross-sex hormones, they don't catch up. You develop a deficit. We know this because we know young girls who have been on Lupron for precocious puberty are suffering osteoporosis in their 20s. We know that the FDA has warned about brain swelling and potential blindness from using this. And we even have some case studies that indicate it can affect your IQ and your executive functioning, as in your IQ will drop when you go on this. So we know that there are some significant risks. We also learned recently that there was a research study commissioned by the NIH of puberty blockers that a physician in California, who's one of the big purveyors of gender-affirming care, refused to publish. Why? Because it showed that these children, their mental health did not improve when they went on puberty blockers. And so she buried the study. She refused to release it. And that came out just within the past couple of weeks. Following going on puberty blockers, at some point these kids are offered cross-sex hormones. Now, when you read the protocol, they make it sound like every step is sort of well thought out. But in my experience talking with parents, what happens is usually this. A young girl or young boy will go on puberty blockers at the age of 12, and within months, by the end of a year, they are on cross-sex hormones. So I just spoke to a mother, over the summer whose daughter was on puberty blockers at 12 and cross-sex hormones at 13. And then at 15, when this young girl wanted to desist, there were no physicians who would help her. She could not find an endocrinologist who was willing to help her child detransition. Unbelievable. These cross-sex hormones, testosterone for girls, estrogen for boys, overwhelm the natural functioning of the body. So this is not like a woman in menopause going on estrogen. This is an artificially, unnaturally high dose because you have to force the body into producing the secondary sex characteristics of the opposite sex. So girls going on testosterone, their voice will drop, they develop facial hair. They'll never lose that facial hair. They will have that the rest of their life. They will never get their voice back. Boys will experience breast development. Everyone experiences fat redistribution, but there are huge risks from this. Metabolic syndrome among that. Cancer, we have no idea what the effects are because this has never been done. We do know the girls all experience vaginal atrophy, and even if they aren't trying to do genital surgery, many of them end up having hysterectomies when they're like 22. Because of the pain they're experiencing. This is followed by surgery. For many of these girls, the double mastectomy comes within like a year of going on testosterone. And one of the reasons why girls want the double mastectomy is if you go back to social transition, one of these things these kids do, these girls in particular do, to socially transition is they will wear a binder, which is like the most restrictive, imagine the most restrictive sports bra, and then ratchet it up a little bit to literally compress their breasts so that they're walking around with their breasts compressed for, 18 hours of the day. It can cause rib fractures, it can cause spinal problems, and so no wonder these girls want a double mastectomy. They're in pain from the breast binder. It's just, and we know they're doing this on minors. We know they're doing this on minors. The surgeries come either in top surgery, which would be a double mastectomy for girls, or breast implants for boys, or genital surgeries where they castrate or sterilize the child and then create a facsimile of the genitalia of the opposite sex. Now we are at the point with these surgeons, though, where they are customizing these genital surgeries. So there's a doctor in the out on the West Coast, Blair Peters, is very, he's like everywhere on social media. And he brags about meeting his patients' embodiment goals. And so a woman will keep her vagina, and then he'll also create a neophallus for her, so that they can have their embodiment goals. Or he'll have a young man, and he keeps his genitalia, but then he creates a neovagina. I mean, just like unbelievable. The complication rates for these surgeries are off the charts. By some estimates with these surgeons, close to 100%. And the combination of puberty blockers plus cross-sex hormones will sterilize a child. Why? Because their reproductive organs do not develop, and then at that crucial period, you put them on cross-sex hormones to force their body in an opposite direction. How do we know that? Because all of these gender clinics offer fertility preservation. All of them. So don't take my word for it. Dig around on their websites. Here in Michigan, Mott Children's Hospital has their own gender clinic. They've put everything behind a wall, so it's hard to find it. But there's a website called Stop the Harm. It's run by the organization Do No Harm that calculated that as of right now, according to some of these insurance payouts, not counting GoFundMes, not counting self-funded procedures, over $3 million has been, they've profited by over $3 million on these very vulnerable children. Okay, so these hospitals are making a lot of money. Why would anyone do this? Well, the number one reason that is being pushed not only on these kids but on these parents is they are being told that unless the child transitions, this child will commit suicide. And understand, this is not just propaganda being pushed at the parents, it's propaganda being pushed at the kids. So that these kids literally think that the only way to save their life is to go through with these procedures. Imagine being in so much psychological anguish that you would agree to these procedures. It only makes sense if you think about a young child who is convinced that this is the only way to save his or her life. Like, that is what's driving this phenomenon. Is that true? No. There is no evidence that not transitioning will cause a child to commit suicide. This doctor I cite here, Laura Edwards-Leeper, was one of the founding members of the Boston Children's Hospital Gender Clinic. And in 2021, she authored an article in one of the Washington papers, I think it was in the Washington Post, where she said, actually, guys, we need to dial back the suicide rhetoric because it's just not true. There's no evidence for that. Now, what is true is that these are kids who are in pain and struggling. And so their risk for self-harm and suicide comes from the fact that they have so many other issues that are driving them to take these steps, right? So some of the studies we have, research studies, estimate that when they show up to the gender clinic, 88% of them have already been diagnosed with a comorbid mental health issue. And these are significant issues that are associated with a higher risk of suicide. Depression, anxiety, sexual trauma, parents with mental health conditions, physical abuse, family conflict, you name it. These are kids who are struggling for a wide variety of reasons. Child Protective Service involvement. Then there's this category of superior intelligence, the quirky, gifted kids who don't really fit in with their peers and are still trying to figure it out, but they're excessively online. Okay? A researcher named Michael Biggs from Oxford University took a look at the waiting list at the for the gender clinic, the Tavistock Gender Clinic in the UK, and he found, now you would think, if not transitioning causes you to commit suicide, and you've got socialized medicine and a 4-year wait to get into the gender clinic, you would think kids would be committing suicide. And he found exactly the opposite. He said the suicide rate, thank God, is extremely, extremely low. I think over the period of time he studied, there were 4 children, tragically, like I'm not minimizing this, who had committed suicide, and 2 of them were already in treatment. So 2 on the list, 2 in treatment. A horrible tragedy. But in no way can you say that unless you transition, you're going to commit suicide. Moreover, we have research that shows that the suicide risk continues even after you undergo a transition, and the risk is elevated 6 years after every intervention. In other words, these procedures do not make a child feel better. They cause them to get worse by every clinical measure. And this is the reason why, when you look across the ocean in Europe, a lot of these European governments are sounding the alarm and backing away from these treatments. But here in the US, because we, for a lot of different reasons, we're not following up on these kids. Our medicine, because it's fee for service and we have a patchwork of many different insurance companies, nobody's paying attention to them. The average follow-up for a research study in the United States is anywhere from 18 months to 3 years. On the other hand, the research that these countries in Europe have done follows these kids from cradle to grave. There were studies, and one of the studies in Sweden took place over 19 years. They followed these people these young people who had gone through these interventions for 19 years. And they're the ones picking up the signal that these are people who are worsening, not getting better, right? The other issue is that even though they will say that this is the standard of care, this is the protocol, this is supported by research, there are many different gradations of research. And in fact, all of these organizations like the Endocrine Society, which recommends transitioning kids, admits that the evidence that they have is low quality. There is no good evidence to support this, and a lot of evidence to say, hold on, this is causing problems. And we can see systematic reviews and meta-analyses have been done by the state of Florida. They have been done in states like Alabama. Alabama wrote a barn burner brief in the Scrimeti case. If you're interested in law at all, read their brief. It just goes through some of the fraud that's taken place. And then in the meantime, WPATH and the American Academy of Pediatricians are using case reports, single case studies, and expert opinion to justify this. It's unconscionable. It really is. But it's important to keep in mind that medicine has gotten things wrong. We have a tendency, my daughter's a physician, my brother's a physician, I get it. I revere their opinion. If I have an issue, I'm calling them no matter how late it is at night. But understand, in the history of medicine, there are some really egregious cases where medicine got things wrong. Right? The history of lobotomy, for example. The creator of the lobotomy won the Nobel Prize 2 years later, right? We can look to the evidence or the testimony of some of the detransitioners who are out there now, a growing body of young people who have been harmed by this medical experimentation, talking about this, expressing their concerns, their problems, talking about the process, about how they were rushed through this transition, and then about the ongoing health problems they're experiencing now. And over again, what we hear from them is no one no one helped me to understand how to accept myself. That was what I needed. I needed to accept myself. So how do we respond? Well, one of the things to understand is it's important to be aware of some of these key influences. And I know I'm over time, right? Am I over time? All right. But so there are several key influences coming into play, especially for our boys. Pornography is a huge influence on them. And there's a whole category of pornography that is ordered around the transgender worldview. In fact, transgender porn is the 4th highest search term on Pornhub. Social media has transgender avatars, etc. You know, young people can adopt this persona. It's being pushed into our schools. I'll really quickly rush through that. And then all of that leads them to these gender clinics. One of the things to keep in mind is just this disparity of time. Our kids are spending, on the average, 2,500 hours a year on their smartphone. And if they're in religious ed, they only get 40 hours a year. If they're in a Catholic school, 1,200 hours a year. But look at that disparity. This is wreaking havoc on their mental health, right? So just really quickly, I'm just going to go through this super fast. We can see that gender ideology is pervasive on social media, whether it's on interactive social media or on the images that they see, the influencers. TikTok is filled with it. We can see that there's a steady diet of gender ideology for even our youngest kids. Our schools are promoting gender ideology from the top down and the bottom up, meaning it's pushed in through the policy, and then they have trainings for even cafeteria workers to make sure that everybody is on board with this. Michigan is, I mean, you guys are, you're not quite California, but you're pretty close. You are pretty close on this. And it's been a determined, concerted effort since 2016 to push this in, okay? Understand, with these interventions, once you ask a child their pronouns, once you talk about sex assigned at birth, you're putting that idea into their mind that every child is potentially transgender, okay? It's affecting our Gen Z in particular. Look at these percentages. This is not natural for 28% of Gen Z to identify as LGBT. For 10% of students, this was a school district in Pittsburgh, socially conservative area, 10% now identifying as transgender. So we have a lot to contend with. But fortunately, our church has very, very, very clear teaching. And we can talk about this a little bit in the Q&A, but I just want to note that, like, sometimes you'll hear people say that the church has not spoken on this issue, and that is categorically false. The church has been talking about this issue from the time it put that phrase sexual identity into the catechism in the 1990s through the entire pontificate of Pope Francis and Pope Benedict before him. We have documents from various dicasteries. We have the USCCB and various bishops, including your own archbishop here. DDF in the Vatican issuing its document on human dignity and putting in a very powerful statement about this. Your own diocese has a pastoral letter on this, making the point that it's never compassionate to approve of these efforts to try to help someone think that they're changing their biological sex. You can see the damage that it's doing, and it is real and significant harm. But what you have to contend with as pastoral workers is the fact that this is, even for the kids who are not affected by gender ideology, who don't identify as transgender, it is affecting their understanding of the human person. And so it makes catechesis that much more difficult, presenting this kind of particular challenge. How do you explain the incarnation if you believe that there is this disconnect between the body and the soul, for example? And not only that, but it's creating an obstacle among our young people, making them less likely to consider the church as a place that's welcoming for people who are struggling. We know that this is one of the number one issues why young people want to walk away from their faith. Okay, I can go over these in the Q&A, but there are so many church teachings on this. Just a few points. Point number one. Okay, this is an ideology. I mentioned it begins with language. it's pervasive. So in response, when we're working on catechesis, we have to be crystal clear with our language. And so I'm begging you, do not use gender identity, gender expression. I don't even use gender. My kids know that. I'm like, they want to trigger me. They'll look at me and say it. And I'm like, don't use gender. Use sex, right? Talk about sex, right? I'm telling my kids to talk about sex. And why? Because we need to reconnect our kids to biological reality. And right now, because our kids are being catechized in school, when they hear gender, they don't think sex, they think gender identity. So you have to always bring them back to the reality of the body. The second point, accompaniment means rooting people in the truth, bringing them closer to God. It doesn't mean shuffling off with them while they wander around searching, right? It means like pointing them in the right way, right? Like, let me walk with you. Here's the way that will make you happy, okay? And then the final point I want to make is that when you're thinking about how to work with these kids, keep in mind 3 key strategies. You want to be proactive, talking to them about the truth about the human person, which means promoting an understanding of Christian anthropology. And no age is too young. No age is too young. We've got to understand what you're trying to do is you're in a culture where this ideology is just corrosive. And what you need to do is you need to sort of build that foundation, create that foundation so they understand who they are. You need to be protective of our kids, which means not only limiting some of the influences on them, right? Like warn them about the dangers of TikTok. Keep them away from some of these like awful things online. But it also means talking to them about gender ideology. And again, no age is too young. I have kids ranging from 13 to 31. I have been working on this issue for 8 years, sadly, right? No age is too young. Let me give you an example. My husband was driving up to a grade school basketball game with one of my younger ones. He was like 3rd grade, right? They're driving along. They're in the middle of Butler, Pennsylvania, which has almost nothing there, right? Except gigantic fields. And as they're driving along, he suddenly said to my husband, Dad. He's like, what is it, Paul? I just saw gender ideology. My husband was like, what? We're literally in the middle of nothing. He goes, Dad, did you see that housing development back there? He's like, I saw it. I just didn't pay attention. He goes, Dad, middle sex? Come on. So my husband told me about that, and I said, I am so proud of him. No age is too young, right? And then the final point I want to make is just like, we've got to be the personal aspect of this. We have to get to these struggling kids before the culture gets them. So when you see a kid who is struggling, do not wait for someone online, on TikTok, on Tumblr, on an online forum to tell them they're trans. Get to know them. Find out what's going on. Their pain is real, but you have to help them to understand how to actually authentically address this. All right. With that, I am going to leave you with these questions. And I know I blitzed through slides. I'll leave this up here after the video. We can come back to this and I can go back for any of your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Farnan. Let's show our gratitude. Wonderful. It was very informative. Thank you so much. Thank you for your excellent presentation. So let's give our speaker a rest and have conversation at your tables until 2:20 when our Q&A will begin. So if you have questions for Dr. Farnan, jot them down on your note cards and then give them to a member of our staff who will be coming around to collect them. So while we wait, I have a video to share from Father Peter Van Rooyen to tell you about our next Equip course offering.
book, which I did not mention, but which
Welcome to Faith, the
maybe I did
Substance-
mention, which Dr. Farnan and Dr. Festigi and also Susan Sellner Wright edited, is called Gender Ideology and Pastoral Practice, a handbook for Catholic clergy, counselors, and ministerial leaders, which means really all of us. And this book has articles by quite a few different people, and the book, you can see the books are on that table there. And they're $25 each, but it's packed with articles. 2 articles by Dr. Farnan. One, Our World Has Lost the Catholic Understanding of the Human Person, so about anthropology. And then another article by Dr. Farnan called Catholic Teaching on Gender Ideology. Last year we had Mary Rice Hassan speak. Mary Rice Hassan, whom you may have heard of, whether you actually heard her speak or not, is Dr. Farnan's sister. So, see, now you're really famous. And Mary Rice Hassan wrote the article, The Impact of Gender Ideology Shaping Culture Across the Globe. There's also an article by Dr. Festigi, whom we have right here, and as I say, who is one of the editors of the book, and his article is entitled Moral Principles and Subjective Culpability. And I also wrote an article, Sacramental Care for People Who Identify as Transgender or Non-Binary. So how do we deal with them with respect to the sacraments? But many other people and articles. There's actually another one by Teresa Farnan. Male and female, he created them, Gender Ideology and Catholic Education. So, enough said. I hope you find the book to be of help to you and you get a copy.
Thank you, Father Ryan. And we will also have an opportunity for a meet and greet with our speaker afterwards. So please avail yourself of that opportunity at the end of our event today. So without further ado, let's hear from Father Peter Ryan.
Welcome to Faith, the Substance of Things Hoped For. I'm your host for this course, Father Peter Van Rooyen. I'm the Director of Graduate Seminarians and Assistant Professor of Theology at Sacred Heart Major Seminary. Sacred Heart offers courses like this one to connect lay Catholics to solid Catholic resources to help them grow in their knowledge of the faith and to equip them for the new evangelization. In this course, we'll begin with the nature and the necessity of Christian faith. Faith is one of the most, at once the most necessary parts of our Christian life, but also one of the most misunderstood. And we're going to consider in particular the supernatural nature of faith. It's through faith that God touches you and His divine life enters into you. We'll consider how we grow in faith then. Faith is always a gift from God, but it's a gift from God that's given to us as a virtue, as a stable disposition of our souls so that we can exercise it and thus grow in faith. And then we'll consider also the demands of faith. Faith is not easy. God asks us to trust Him and to believe what He has said because He has said it. And so this means sometimes God will lead us places where we don't want to go, and sometimes where we don't know where He's leading us. But as we follow Him in faith, there is joy, because we are with Jesus. And so we'll conclude noting even the darkness of faith. Through faith, God's divine life enters into you. But again, this doesn't preclude darkness or storms. And we'll see that in the scripture, but also with St. Teresa of Calcutta and also St. Therese of Lisieux. We'll see in their lives darkness, but also deep faith through which we cling to God and hold on to Him in the darkness. And so we'll see how in every dimension of our lives, no matter what kind of struggles we face, no matter what kind of poverty of spirit we experience in our own lives, as we cling to God in faith, His divine life comes to us. And so we can rejoice with St. Paul that joined to Christ Jesus, all things work for the good, because we have Jesus and we have His eternal life already growing in us, because faith is the substance of things hoped for. So if you haven't signed up yet, please follow the link in the video. And from all of us at Sacred Heart, thank you and God bless you.
We had over 3,000 3,000 participants in our Equip courses. So please follow that link, sign up online, don't miss out. Tell your friends, ask your pastor if you have an Equip subscription at your parish, which would give you free access to all Equip materials, even beyond the free courses that we offer every year. So there's a flyer on the table over there. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Michael Grzinski, Assistant Director of Admissions, to come up and speak with you for a couple of minutes today. Michael?
Hello, everybody. As Dr. Clark said, my name is Michael Grzinski. I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions here. And I just want to let you guys know that not only do we have a world-class seminary here, but we have a world-class faculty. Yeah, looking at you, Dr. Fasigi. And we offer lay programs. And there's a lot of people in the Archdiocese of Detroit that still don't know that. So we offer master's degrees in theology. We offer a Master of Arts in Pastoral Studies. We offer a certificate in Catholic theology, which is a little bit less intense maybe than a full master's degree. So I want to let you guys know that there are these opportunities. We also have an Equip platform, which is free or nearly free courses that our faculty put together, and we're building out more every single year. So if you guys are interested in this ongoing formation, or you might feel called to it, myself or my colleague, I almost called you Dr. Dominic Carlini, can help you out, and you can go onto our website, and that lists all of our programs there as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And be sure to say hello to them before you leave. So I'm going to put the discussion questions back up for you, and so we will resume our conversation between Dr. Farnan and Father Ryan at 2:20.